Hello, this is Dr. Coates. It is February 26th, at least my computer tells me, and here's a lecture on the pastoral, which is a type of poetic genre we talked about briefly before, and which does merge a bit with another poetic genre called the elegy, and what's called the pastoral elegy, so we'll come back to this at some point. But it does tend to lead to a very specific set of images, which is why we're talking about it today. In fact, many times people will associate this particular set of images with poetry itself. But just to be very quick about it, I mean, the pastoral is a sort of poem, and it has to do with nature. And so any sort of nature poem has elements of the pastoral, even if you might not think of it as a pastoral itself. So that's the reason why we're talking about it. Anytime you might find yourself thinking of a natural image or an image out of nature, you are doing that along the lines of the pastoral, and so it's best to acknowledge and be aware of that. So today we discuss the pastoral, which we can define broadly as a poetic genre that involves some treatment of rural life. We can get more specific, though. When one does that, it also tends to exclude some poems that only belong loosely to the genre, such as A.E. Housman's To an Athlete Dying Young, which could as easily be called a sport poem if that one, because it's about an athlete, if such a genre existed. The only other one I can think of offhand is Casey at the Bat, though that might be another candidate for the sport poem genre. So there is some sense to talking about the pastoral as sort of a mode, anything having to do with natural images. But there actually is, this more clearly defined genre too. So this is from the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics, which I have right here. Sorry, there it is. It's a really thick book, but of course you only look at the entry that you're interested in. And here's what they say. The pastoral is a fictionalized imitation of rural life, usually the life of an imaginary golden age, in which the loves of shepherds and shepherdesses play a prominent part. Its ends are sometimes sentimental and romantic, but sometimes satirical or political. So there you go. That's the more precise definition. Of course, I'm going to spend the rest of this lecture giving you my own take on it, as you would expect, and as it's one of the reasons it's a perk of the job that we don't have to just take what the encyclopedia tells us, but we can also spin it in something which I think will be more useful, at least in terms of looking at the poems that I assigned for this week. Besides, that definition from the big book is likely unsatisfactory to you, since we can probably all think of instances of poetry that deal with the various virtues of hard work and outdoorsiness, and therefore participate in this grand effort to represent the natural landscape within poetry, while still noting that no real attempt to depict shepherds is present. Must it have a shepherd? I would say probably not, although it probably needs to have somebody who is outdoors, tending, maybe not the sheep, but something out in nature. Instead of just describing a rock or something, which, while it is outdoors, might have nothing to do with the person trying to do something within the landscape. Still, as you've heard me say about genre many times before, any new revision to an ancient genre is still hearkening back to its classical forms, and much of their effect is dependent on your deeper understanding of the genre as you read them. So let's talk about the history of the pastoral. The pastoral is an ancient genre dating back to classical literature. And by classical literature, I mean like the ancient Romans and Greeks. The Roman poet Virgil popularized a few forms of pastoral, and those are actually called bucolics, which is sometimes an adjective used, bucolic, is an adjective sometimes used to describe like a rustic natural scene on a really pretty day. But in terms of Virgil's actual poems, they're grouped into two sets. One was called the eclogues, and the other one was called the georgics. The eclogue sought to use natural scenery to create a moral lesson or revelation for the reader and for a character within the poem, while the georgic was a didactic poem, something that was meant to teach, that used the rustic simplicity of country life, especially the virtue and dignity of honest toil, to exhort the reader to better living. And on a personal note, I have to say, even the briefest encounter that we might have with American politics should show that the sort of associations that Virgil was trying to sponsor between farmers and virtuousness are still alive and well in our republic. Any truck commercial on TV, usually during a sporting event, for example, is basically selling its male viewers the image of tough, rustic, uncomplicated toil in an attempt to get them to buy in, not just to the Dodge Ram or the Ford 150 as a tool to haul heavy things about and do some lifting, but to a certain, circumscribed image of masculine heteronormativity. Like, manly men drive this truck. And even if you don't find yourself, needing to carry 2 tons of rocks, You know, if you buy this truck, you could, and that means that you're actually sort of buying into that vision of manliness. Now, you and I may be able to acknowledge consciously that not every farmer we might meet is going to be a paragon of virtue and kindness. They're actually just as likely to be bigots or zealots as the next person, and perhaps they are more probable to be one of those, and also closed-minded, provincial, and intolerant because of their isolation from the cityfied city folk, who actually have to deal with other people on a daily basis rather than to work with their hands. But the power of the pastoral as a moral representation of certain character types derives from the proximity of the rural worker to the land. The land confides no virtue to the laborer who works it, but those of us who might feel alienated from the landscape as a vital source of sustenance and meaning can't help but look at natural representations with a sense of longing and indebtedness. So I think that's what's happening. Usually within a pastoral there is this thing called the locus amenus, and this is Latin for the happy place. It's a modular pastoral topos, or commonplace, that's found in all the genres, but originates within the pastoral poem. And examples of those might be the Forest of Arden in Shakespeare's play As You Like It, or the Bower of Bliss in Edmund Spenser's poem, long epic, The Fairy Queen, the City of El Dorado in Voltaire's Candide, or even the Bramble Patch in Zane Grey's Riders of the Purple Sage, if you're into westerns. I'm actually going to compare it to Dagobah in The Empire Strikes Back in just a second, though, so hang on if none of those if none of those rung a bell for you. The locus amenus arises unheralded, seemingly out of nowhere, and all of a sudden, there you are. It promises perfect safety to everybody who's in it, but you can't stay in it for very long. It's ephemeral, right? It's a momentary or transitory thing. Classical pastorals called this place Arcadia, which was the Latin version of the Greek Elysian fields. But in the Christian era, we would call this an Edenic, or after Eden, right? Like after the Garden of Eden. This sort of ephemeral place that happily arises within a narrative or within a poem. Even so, there's an equally strong tradition dating back to antiquity to place a reminder of ephemerality and death within the locus amenus, and it's partly one of the reasons why you can't stay there for very long. So, and here's the Empire Strikes Back reference, but think of that creepy tree where Luke Skywalker fights a phantom Darth Vader, against Yoda's wishes in Dagobah and Empire Strikes Back. And of course, he kind of he beats Darth, but then reveals to himself the fact that he was the one that brought the evil into the locus amenus in the first place, and that was both Yoda's way of showing him that he was ready to go off and fight the real Darth, but also a sign that his idyllic interlude was at an end. He had to go in and help his friends, as he says. We call that particular type of scene a memento mori, which again is Latin, in this case for a reminder of death. And it's a literalized move in several paintings from the 17th century, and I've attached an image from a painting called Et in Arcadia Ego, which is just Latin, from a phrase that means roughly, I'm in Arcadia too. And so if you're thinking about Arcadia as being somehow equivalent to the Garden of Eden, then it would be, like the image of the snake. If you're thinking of a painting that might be represented what Adam and Eve went through in the Garden of Eden, the snake would be the memento mori, death. And they only experienced death, of course, after they exited the garden, but the reason they exited it was because of the snake. So, let's see, that image itself is most often connected with a painter called Nicolas Poussin from the early 1630s, but the one that I'm attaching, which I thought was a little bit better, it has a skull. So like the skull in this really beautiful pastoral landscape that is the reminder that death will enter into this interlude as well. That one was by the painter Guercino from the early 1600s. Anyway, so the memento mori and the locus amenus are two things that you should be looking for really in any pastoral or in any poem that seems to be lingering more than usual on natural imagery. Okay, because they are there, even if they're implicit. Now, tastes in the pastoral have changed over time, as we would expect. Tastes in poetry are changing all the time, and that's the reason why poetry doesn't stay exactly the same, but it keeps changing with every time period. The pastoral of Alexander Pope's day, and I gave an example of this in the poem Windsor Forest from the 18th century for this week's poems. It delights not so much in the beauty of the landscape itself, but in the ways that human beings have brought order to the chaos of natural things. And here's a quote from lines 13 to 16 of that poem. Not chaos like together crushed and bruised, but as the world harmoniously confused, where order and variety we see, and where, though all things differ, all agree. Okay? End quote. If you've ever visited a mansion constructed during the 18th century, and it doesn't have to be in Britain, the ones I'm about to mention are all here in Virginia, actually, you will doubtless have pictured a perfectly symmetrical garden when I was reading those lines, like those that can still be seen at James Madison's house, Montpelier, or at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, which is on the back of everybody's nickel, although not the garden, just the mansion itself. It is perfectly symmetrical, though, because that was Monticello is a great example of 18th century architecture. But I suppose if you've ever been to Washington, D.C., if you remember the National Mall, with the monument at its head, and it goes all the way down to the Capitol Dome. I mean, it's a giant rectangle, so that's obviously symmetrical too. The White House, the Capitol building itself, those are all symmetrical. The 18th century taste in architecture was a taste for symmetry. Montpelier, by the way, since I visited that, it's near Barbersville, north of Charlottesville. So if you took 29 up from Charlottesville, you would eventually get to Montpelier. I think you can also take 33, although I wouldn't suggest starting at Staples Mill and going northwest. Anyway, Montpelier has this thing called a deist temple in it, which is to say there's a marble circular platform with an arched domed roof supported by Doric columns in this little circle, which wasn't really much wider than Madison himself, and he was a really little guy. I don't know if you've ever seen paintings of him. But anyway, so all of this classical architecture in this little deist temple, and there's no such thing at Monticello, but what Madison used that for is he would go and stand on it and then just kind of do this 360-degree turn and survey his land. It's not as though he was disconnected from the environment, because here he is in the midst of all this nature. But since it was all his land and he got to tell his gardener how to shape the landscape after all, it's not as though he desired to find himself in the middle of some raw, untamed scene. He liked what Pope called order and variety. He liked to see that everything was as he had planned it. The Romantics, with a big R, capital R, the name for the group of nature poets of the early 19th century, meanwhile, like Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, Byron, and Shelley, they reacted against Pope and the other classicists from the 18th century in that they preferred the raw scene, exactly what the 18th centuryists wanted to order. Right? They wanted direct communication between nature and themselves, if that's even possible. And for some of those Romantic poets, the apex of experience would be to find some vista that had never been seen before, and to revel in the delight such a sight would render up to the viewer. This was, in other words, a preference for the unplanned, the fortuitous, the new, and the wild. Right? The Romantics turned to the pastoral not to remind themselves of religious and moral lessons, but to experience unadulterated nature with a capital N. And by the way, the American version of Romanticism is often called Transcendentalism, and some of you may have read Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay Nature in high school, which also advises everyone to go out and experience nature on nature's terms, rather than to go out and make a garden. And I admit I'm pretty sympathetic to this view of nature, which ceases to ask how we can best exploit natural resources, and instead spends more energy on delighting in what the universe has to show us, than how can I mine this? How can I strip mine this hill? Right? Which is not exactly what Alexander Pope was saying, I know, but I think Pope would have been more pleased with, the purposes or the use that we could put the landscape than Wordsworth would have, for example. But there should be a few qualifications to Romantic nature poetry, which the modern poets, and here I'm using modern as anything that comes after the 1899. So even though it's most of the 20th century that we speak of, we're still new enough within the 21st century not to really understand exactly what it is people are saying nowadays. So you and I should think of ourselves as moderns. Anyway, there should be a few qualifications to Romantic views of nature, which the moderns have brought to bear. That the experience of nature needs to be tempered with humility, for example, or else you risk enjoying nature not for nature's sake, but for your own sake, out of egotism. You'll remember from week 1 Wordsworth's poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. Remember that one? And all of a sudden, the speaker unexpectedly stumbles onto a field full of daffodils. Daffodils, and he kind of has a little orgy with the daffodils, which is great, right? I mean, it's wonderful for people to love daffodils and flowers and beautiful things. But the daffodils don't really get much description or play in their own terms. The poem is really more about how awesome it was to find the daffodils, and therefore how great Wordsworth's speaker is, than it is about the awesomeness of daffodils themselves. We could easily have replaced daffodils with some other type of flower, or maybe even flour, the baking flour, O-U-R. And Wordsworth might still have been just as tickled with himself, because it was really more about Wordsworth. This is the critique of Romantic egomania that I see Frost depicting in his poem, The Most of It, which I'm having you read for this week. for example. Although I don't want to say too much about that because I know that some people are working on that one. Modern pastorals do not flinch from portraying modern landscapes, fraught though they may be with vulnerability and decay thanks to the onrush of technology and modernity. But even so, one cannot speak within a poetic genre without also sounding all of one's forebears at the same time, and even by distinguishing a poetic setting like that of Isaac Rosenberg's Break of Day in the Trenches, and these are the trenches of World War I, which is about as unbeautiful a setting as one can have, considering the trenches were these like 9-foot deep trenches that you would dig in the ground, and in between that trench and the enemy across from you's trench, there would be like barbed wire holes from shells that had been lobbed by howitzers, and of course dead bodies, which no one can safely bury because people are shooting at you constantly. Right? So, deeply unbeautiful setting. Even by distinguishing that kind of poem from the more classical landscapes that you're used to in the pastoral, those poems still evoke the plural of locus aminus, the loci aminus, and mementos mori. They're there. I mean, obviously the memento mori is going to be there anyway because it's during war, the Break of Day in the Trenches. But the urge to read these poems because they do hearken to that sort of pastoral imagery is going to be so strong that you will still be able to see those two forms, even though it seems like it's an anti-pastoral. But consider that modern poets like Rosenberg, Robert Frost, and A.E. Housman, they know that you have that urge to construe things as, you know, beautiful, as a typical pastoral, and they're probably playing around with you, or at least with that urge. And I'll have a screencast of the Rosenberg poem to accompany this lecture, so please turn your attention to that next, after you hear me out in this next paragraph. But one last thing, strict pastorals have entered a decline after the early 19th century. Wordsworth's poem Michael, which I did not have you read, but which is a pastoral, is probably the last major representative of this genre in English, although that doesn't mean that poets weren't still experimenting with the pastoral, or at least with pastoral imagery. So, for example, W.B. Yeats, whom we read Sailing to Byzantium and discussed last week, his first two published poems ever in 1889 were The Song of the Happy Shepherd, who was indeed very happy, and a shepherd, so that's pastoral, and then the second one was called The Sad Shepherd, who was too depressed to sing about anything. Right? So that kind of represents what I was just talking about in terms of the turn from the romantic egomania to modern self-criticism and humility. Partly this is due to the success with which the treatment of pastoral subjects had been modernized. It no longer required rustic shepherds because there are just fewer of those nowadays. And also the thoroughness with which the urban landscape had become the dominant setting for poetic audiences, simply because most people lived in cities. Another influence was the growing abhorrence of what the Victorian art critic John Ruskin called the pathetic fallacy, which, as you might imagine, is rampant within poetic pastorals, right? Because it's all about an observer looking at a natural scene, and it's very difficult to keep oneself from like exporting the emotions that you're feeling onto that setting. Talking about a glowering mountain, or like a happy like glen of trees or something like that. The idea that it was fallacious to project one's emotional or psychological state onto the landscape, thereby attempting to externalize and somehow legitimize or universalize your emotional state, right? So as that became less and less the thing that you could do, then the pastoral also kind of declined in its popularity. But the difference between the modern pastoral and the pastorals of the Romantic period and its predecessors in the 18th century and the Classical period is that although readers of all of these examples of the genre might expect the poem to arrive at some sort of moral or universal truth as illustrated within a natural setting, the modern examples do so through an individually depicted consciousness that may or may not be correct in the didactic lesson he or she draws from the adventure with nature. There's still an adventure with nature, in other words. And if you're thinking of The Most of It by Frost, again, that might be a great example of this particular like representative. But the attempt is to depict the mind making sense of things, not to state rather baldly that this is what nature in fact means. Modern pastorals make their didactic tropes ironic, in other words. They also tend to make the locus aminus particularly ephemeral, and not just fleeting, but like really, really fleeting, maybe just an instant of awareness or revelation, and then it's gone. Or perhaps no great shakes to begin with, right? For example, the break of day in the trenches maybe is the only safe time during the day, but it too is just an instance, and maybe that even wasn't all that safe, right? So in other words, the modern pastoral is an ironic pastoral. Maybe it never really did provide that revelation or that connection with nature, right? Maybe we were just fooling ourselves all along, modern pastoral poets might be suggesting. However, having said that, the one thing that I think they're never ironic about is the seriousness of death. The memento mori is just as deadly in modern pastorals as it ever was. And if you think back about what happened during the 20th century, especially the 2 world wars and how horrific they were, I think that might become clear. So thank you for listening to this lecture, and please check out the screencast that I have attached to it right now or whenever it's most convenient for you. And I will see you on Thursday.